Hey, I want to discuss something that is very, very prominent on cyberspace. I suppose this could partly be tied into my video about the history of people being online in less than savory moments, although it's a different issue specifically. Um, yeah, I want to talk about the phenomenon of street fights. Um, and this is something that unfortunately in my view, is very, very dominant on cyberspace. Um, Very often these videos have millions of views, so this is clearly a very big phenomenon. And whilst street fights have always been an issue, now in the digital age, it adds a new dimension when a private dispute between two individuals, or sometimes more, can then become this sort of form of mass entertainment amongst a potentially international audience, especially in the case of YouTube. Um, YouTube obviously is one of the biggest social network sites, one of the biggest, well, I should say, video sharing sites. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about this phenomenon. Firstly, how do we define a street fight? Well, the way I use this word is in the context of basically two individuals having a bust up outside, and outside a formal controlled setting. Now, what I mean by formal and controlled is a sporting event. We know that there are some martial arts that require aggression, controlled aggression, involve fighting. So boxing, MMA, etc. And I want to be clear that I'm not sort of a pacifist person. I believe that there is a place for martial arts, hence the word arts. I fully respect the opinions of those who don't like those sports, but I do think it's very, very important to differentiate between a sport and what happens outside. I've made a video about this about 2 years ago, but this is an update because maybe I can share some of the thoughts on this. I have to say it's a phenomenon that makes me quite uncomfortable, and the reason being is that a lot of the people involved tend to be young people, in some cases barely children. So, although I don't consider myself puritanical, I do think this should be something that all responsible-minded adults should be concerned about. I mean, I'm not a father, I don't have children, but that's not the point. I do think it's problematic when you have this phenomenon that, in many cases, young people, not always, sometimes you have adults who should know better, but very often people who don't look much more than being in their late teens getting into these fist fights and basically I call it a street fight on the grounds that they usually take place in a street setting. Um, I've come across a few of these from Hawaii, for example. I mean, they're from all over the world, but the ones I've seen from Hawaii, the interesting thing is that they really look like they are in an actual martial arts competition. Like this is not child's play. This is really it's real punches these guys and sometimes girls are throwing. And there's usually a big crowd around watching them. But what troubles me about this is that unlike a professional sporting contest, or even an amateur sporting contest, there's absolutely no control. Everyone who is there solely to watch it. And there seems to be, there's definitely a different dimension from a sporting world. Now, in a sporting world, of course, there's a lot to prove, and of course, there's pressure and competition. Um, but the point is, in a sporting context, there are responsible people involved in those events. There's usually a ringside doctor. There is a referee. There is, I mean, before my fight, I had to get my blood tested, my blood pressure tested from medical professionals. Um, and there's always medical personnel on hand if something does go wrong. which unfortunately does occasionally happen. Um, but generally speaking, in a boxing match, there's no personal animosity. It's simply, as Chris Eubanks said, business. I'm not saying there never is. There is sometimes, and I'm not saying that it's. I fully understand people who don't like the sport and they think it's violent and all the rest of it, but I would ask them to really consider that in a boxing match, for example, you have timed rounds, 3 minute rounds. You have a break. The fighter gets advice from his corner and so on. With the exception of maybe Irish traveller fights, most of these street fights have none of that. It's completely reckless. You have two people just hammering away at each other. Um, Most of the time, it doesn't look like it's very serious damage, but sometimes there is. And the disturbing thing is that, especially when it's young people involved, they there's no sort of control over the situation. I mean, I've seen some of these street fights spill onto a busy road, and then motorists hooting their horns for obvious reasons because they're concerned adults and they're thinking that it's obviously dangerous. I mean, the thing is, in a boxing match, you have a square ring. No one else gets involved. Okay, it might be you might have a hostile crowd, but you have professionals there whose job is to keep the fighters safe. In a street fight, you have people who have not trained professionally. That's another difference. You know, these are not people who have trained for weeks on end with a trainer, um, and they went through all the psychology. Very often, these are spur of the moment things. And I've seen situations where people have been slammed on the hard concrete. Um, in fact, in the UK a few years ago, we had a case of a 16-year-old schoolboy who got into a fight at school. He ended up in intensive care and he died there that evening because in the fight he'd been thrown onto the side of a road and he hit his head on a curb, which, if you don't know, that's might be a different term in different countries. That is the sort of concrete barrier between a footpath and a road, sidewalk for my American viewers. And he died all over something really stupid. Um, I'm not saying that there is never ever a justification for aggression outside a controlled setting. There may be situations when people have no choice but to defend themselves from an unprovoked assault, or if they have to defend someone else. And I've made another video talking about violence against women and how, as a man, if I absolutely had to be in that situation, I would. Although I still would always see violence as a last resort, and I think every responsible person should see it as a last resort. It's different in a controlled sporting setting because, you know, generally speaking, boxers and martial artists don't actually want to kill their opponent. In a street fight, there is real anger there, and in some cases, eventually people have to prize them apart. Now, you would never get that in boxing because professional fighters, the referee tells them to break, they do, because they know that they will lose points if they don't. And generally speaking, at the end of the fight, they embrace it and wish each other well. So for the most part, it's good natured is probably the wrong word, but it's a very, very different environment from a street fight. The other thing about street fight is in a professional sporting contest, you have fans who come and pay to watch fighters. Most of the time, there's not personal grievances involved in that. Sometimes there would be, and half the time that's to sell the fight. But in a street fight, it's usually something very personal, like a love triangle, or something stupid like trying to prove who is stronger. Well, I suppose in a sporting contest that's the point as well. But the difference is, very often in these street fights, I think there's a peer pressure dynamic, and if someone is, it disturbs me the number of young people who sort of encourage these situations, and very often there doesn't seem to be any adults around to sort of take some responsibility and break them up. Um, and I think it's a very difficult situation. I mean, obviously they wouldn't want their parents coming in and breaking it up. Be very embarrassing. But it's just troubling that these situations emerge in the first place, and there's no real easy answers for this. But I do think that YouTube needs to crack down on it and at least not give them the publicity because the people who upload these videos, and this is another thing, very often it's not a 50-50 scenario of just two people having a fight. More often than not, what we're actually seeing in these videos is actual bullying. Um, and people just being outright assaulted. Half the time they're not even fights. They're a case of someone being assaulted. I saw one video of a girl, another girl confronted her in her own house. It was some personal dispute about a boy. I don't know what it was, but the second girl assaulted her, dragged her from her home, and then started beating her up really badly. And nobody was intervening. Nobody was trying to stop this. Um, and in the civilized world, people, this is not something that should be encouraged. Um, like I said, I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I'm not going to say there are never circumstances where it is justified. And I understand sometimes people get angry to a point where they do want to use violence. I'm not going to lie, there's been times when I've wanted to swing out at someone. But the crucial thing is that dividing line, thinking about something and acting on it. Now, I'm not going to lie, if I had a girlfriend and another guy slept with her or something like that, I'd probably want to confront the guy. It's a human instinct. But the thing about street fights is they're reckless, and they do depress me because they seem to get a lot of support, and it just I can't understand how there's no responsible adults around that are intervening in these cases. Sometimes you see police officers intervening, sometimes you see responsible adults, but in the cases of young people, especially, it troubles me. Now, I don't want to sound like when I was a lad, in the good old days. I'm a young man. I'm 29 years old, so I'm not speaking here as someone completely detached from this generation. Um, but it does trouble me, and I would like to think if I was to walk past a situation like this, I'd like to think I had the decency to go in and break it up. If I saw two young people fighting, if I saw two adult men, I wouldn't get involved. I still don't think it's a good way to settle things, but that wouldn't be my business. But if it was young people, then yeah, I think I would get involved, especially if I thought it was a case of, say, a gang attacking an individual or something. Um, I've seen other cases where adults have got into stupid disputes and ended up beating each other up in front of children. I think that's utterly disgraceful. One thing I would say about this, some people try to make it into a racial thing. The truth is, you can find this among all racial groups. You can find it amongst the African American community. You can find it amongst the white community. You can find it amongst the Hispanic community. So to try and racialize it, I think is doesn't really help the problem. So I'd like to ask people watching is what do you make of this phenomenon? Do you think it is something that can be sort of reined in on? I'm not naive. I don't think it will ever be completely, you can sort of eradicate this problem. But I do think it's a problem. We shouldn't see this as something that's funny or entertaining because in many situations, um, there's a real risk there, not necessarily from the other person, but from the fact that they're reckless. They don't, I mean, all it takes is one person to like throw their opponent onto a busy road, a car hits that person, and then we're talking about manslaughter, all from a stupid dispute. In many cases, you see real violence, like people being thrown against hard concrete, and there's this sort of thing about glorifying how hard people are. That shouldn't be the issue. The issue should be about acting in a responsible way. And in the adult world, you can't go around beating up people because you disagree with them. Um, So if these young people really want to get involved in martial arts, and the thing is, some of them actually look like they have some real skill, then they should sign up and become a martial artist or do it to relieve anger or something. But in the real world, you cannot act like that. Um, and I'm not going to say it's never ever justified. I think that's naive. I think there's times when confrontation and aggression are justified in cases of defending someone. But I think a responsible person should always, always try to avoid that situation. So, say for example, I had an argument with a guy, and he challenged me to a fight. I'd say, look, this is ridiculous. We're adults. Let's sort this out as adults. And if the guy persisted and if he like threw a punch at me, of course I'd defend myself. If he threatened someone I cared about, I definitely that would be different. But so if it was just me, I would avoid violence most of the time because it's stupid. Um, it's different in a martial arts situation where you have trained for weeks to do that. Um, I know there are people who can definitely defend themselves. I think I could probably defend myself, but that really isn't the point. Um, So yeah, basically what I'm saying is street fights are stupid, and especially when they involve young people, it's unsettling. And I see this a lot. It seems to be a big problem in the States, but we do have it here in the UK. I've seen it from the Philippines. I've seen it in Brazil. It is a worldwide phenomenon, and it is something that is very. It should definitely be discouraged. So I think this is not about being a prude. I mean, I'm not puritanical about these things, but I do think it's a big problem when a lot of young people are involved, and especially in cases where it's blatantly bullying, where it's blatantly one person attacking another person, and that person is doing barely anything to defend themselves, and then you have a crowd cheering them on. So when you have a crowd cheering on two 13-year-olds to beat each other up, I find that very unsettling. As a responsible minded adult, I think that is something that needs to be stopped. There needs to be some way to rein in on that. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on this. Um, I think in terms of it being on videos, sometimes incidentally, when it's cases of bullying, putting it online is like that disgusts me. It's like making it. It's like trying to humiliate the victim even more by letting millions of people watch their beat down and all these sort of terms. I do think sometimes there's aspects of the media don't help, and I'm not one of these people that sort of says, violence in the media produces real life violence. I don't necessarily believe that, but equally, I don't think that you can say it's got no influence, because very often in these situations you hear them say things like, "Oh, she's harder than you," or "Throw your right," and this sort of thing, and it's like they're goading the the combatants on, and it's just it's unsettling. Let me know your thoughts. Cheers.